I want to thank my colleagues for joining us here on the dais. And I notice in the back of the room some military families joining us again, and thank you for enlightening us and telling us about the problem so that we can move forward with a solution. In February, this committee heard from a panel of very courageous military spouses who told us of the unhealthy and unsanitary living conditions that they were experiencing in the privatized military housing and the continuing impacts these conditions have on the health of their families. In addition to our panelists, this committee and many of our members have received thousands of emails and letters with similar accounts of mold, lead contamination, shoddy maintenance, shoddy workmanship, unprofessional property management staff. These accounts paint an unsettling picture of many of our privatized family housing developments. Equally disturbing is the fact that when these families reached out to their chain of command for help, instead of getting the support that they desperately needed, they received shrugs of indifference. And they were told that there was nothing the military service could do to help them. Well, that was the wrong answer. We heard from them, we held a committee hearing, and we're here today to hear what the United States military is doing to support their families and the services that they provide to this country. In recent weeks, the military services seem to have become energized about getting to the root cause of this crisis. We have heard encouraging news from senior leadership of the engagement of health and safety inspections, Inspector General investigations into work order processes, and housing hotlines to expedite getting families the needed help. However, efforts have been performed. These efforts have been performed at the headquarters level, and they may not have necessarily trickled down to the installations. We continue to receive large amounts of correspondence from families struggling in today's privatized housing. We've heard that in some cases, the very efforts headquarters have put in place to improve the situation have led to counterproductive practices, like closing the maintenance work orders too quickly, and instead of using privatized partners, non-disclosure agreements are often used also. The services must expeditiously move from their assessment mode into implementation. They must use best practices from the housing developments that are working well and quickly implement the fixes required to conduct effective oversight at headquarters level and provide the necessary support to our military families at their installations. I expect our witnesses will provide us with information on the steps they're taking today to make headway on these issues and a detailed roadmap from here into the midterm and long term to keep this issue from ever happening again. Our families deserve better, and this committee will demand that the services do better. With that, I'd like to turn to my ranking member and good friend, Doug Lamborn of Colorado, for any remarks you may have.
Okay, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this important hearing. This is the second hearing we've had on this extremely important topic. To begin with, I want to commend the courage and persistence of military spouses for bringing this issue to our attention. Without the diligence of military families raising their voices on behalf of others, we might still be uninformed about these troubling problems. This was truly a grassroots effort in the best tradition of America. Sadly, our collective management of military family housing was not in keeping with our proud traditions. There is no question that Congress and the military services were less than diligent in our oversight. My colleagues will recall the compelling testimony we had from several military spouses last February. They described an unyielding bureaucracy unwilling to address health issues and closing work orders with no real resolution. The frustrations they faced in trying to resolve health and safety concerns for their families made a deep impression on all of us. Thankfully, the military services now understand and accept that they have not provided adequate oversight over housing programs, and they are each taking steps to improve the situation. To be sure, not all housing programs suffered from mismanagement. Even so, the general disengagement of service leadership and the evisceration of housing staff, particularly at installation level, left a void. That void led to mismanagement at too many projects. By now, the military departments have assessed the situation. We are here to learn what needs to be done to fix the problems and maintain those fixes into the future. There is no more important work for this subcommittee to undertake, and we will work with our Senate colleagues to make sure that this important issue is addressed as successfully as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses, but before they start, as I think all of us know, we will have votes in about an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, so we're going to move along a little more expeditiously than normal. So, Mr. Robert McMahon, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment, we welcome you. Also, Mr. Thomas Moldley, Undersecretary of the Navy, Mr. John Henderson, the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations, Environment, and Energy, Mr. Alex Beller, Assistant Secretary of Army for Installations, Energy, and Environment for the Army. All of us should note that Undersecretary Moldley appears before us today due to the turnover of personnel in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, and his seniority should in no way reflect negatively on the Air Force, Army, or Department of Defense, who send the people that are specifically responsible. So having done that little bit of appropriate, we will now move on. So let's start with Mr. McMahon.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity today to testify on military housing. I'd like to begin by acknowledging all of the family members that have come forward in recent months to share their experience. This took tremendous courage, and we appreciate not only what they did, but more importantly, what they do every day in support of their spouses. What we have heard from them reinforces that we collectively must do significantly better. For those of us that have lived in military housing before privatization, and I have lived in 9 different base homes during my 34-year military career, we know that the quality of privatized housing is significantly better than when DOD managed it. However, for more than 80% of our current military population who didn't experience the poor housing of the past, this is all they know, and they expect us to get it right 100% of the time. As you know, 70% of our military members live off base. For the 30% that live on base, our goal is to offer them a safe, high quality, and affordable home where they want and choose to live. We must and will do better. We need to improve upon communications. We need to improve upon engagement, and we need to improve upon responsiveness. At the same time, we must ensure the long-term viability of our privatized housing projects so that the future residents will have high-quality housing 20 years from now as well. It is important to distinguish between what housing privatization is and what it is not. The key element is that we no longer own privatized homes. This does not mean we should not have oversight responsibilities and authorities, but it does mean that we do not have contracts to be governed by clauses. As such, we exercise our authority through the agreements we have entered into with our privatized partners. This partnership is key. We must fulfill our oversight responsibilities, and our partners must meet their obligations as landlords. Since the beginning of the year, the military departments have conducted an intense campaign consisting of site visits, reviews of privatized housing conditions, meetings with families and communities, and senior-level discussions with privatization partners to address property management issues. We've developed a series of corrective actions based upon this campaign that we are now putting in motion, categorized in terms of near-term, mid-term, and long-term. Examples of these actions include implementing a resident Bill of Rights, determining the feasibility of developing a common tenant lease, clarifying processes for residents to raise health concerns and for health providers to report issues as appropriate, and establishing resident customer care advocates. The Department of Defense is committed to working closely with you and your staff to ensure our members and families have safe places to live, work, play, and pray. We and our industry partners are fully committed to first ensuring that today's residents of privatized housing have a safe, high-quality, and affordable home, where they want to live and choose to live, and secondly, ensuring the long-term viability of our privatized housing projects so that our future residents 20 years from now have exactly the same thing. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Modley.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, distinguished members of the Readiness Subcommittee, on behalf of the Secretary of the Navy, Richard V. Spencer, thank you for the opportunity to testify to you regarding the urgent actions we are taking to immediately improve privatized housing and the quality of life for our sailors, Marines, and their families. As you well know, we ask a tremendous amount from the members of our Navy Marine Corps team in defending our nation. So to learn that we, as the Department of the Navy and its leadership, have not fully lived up to our commitments to provide quality, safe housing was both embarrassing and alarming to us. It was embarrassing because it reflects poorly across our entire naval institution, to include those thousands of people who actually work extremely hard every day to ensure that those goals and objectives are met. And alarming in that it raised a number of systemic issues that we needed to correct, issues that should have been addressed long ago, given our solemn commitment to each and every service member and their families that we take care of them to the very best of our ability. In the end, this issue is not so much about property management as it is about leadership. We have recommitted ourselves to fixing this problem so that our people are provided the housing they deserve and so that they can focus on the important jobs we ask them to do. Therefore, we are comprehensively reviewing the business systems, reporting mechanisms, and oversight procedures governing the way housing maintenance issues are reported, remediated, and verified in privatized housing. We are also striving to make personal contact with every sailor and Marine who lives in a PPV housing unit. And to date, I'm proud to say that the Navy is 100% complete on that task, reaching over 44,000 sailors living in PPV or government-run housing. The Marine Corps will be complete with this task by April 15th, and to date, they have made direct contact face-to-face with over 58,000 Marines. I have also directed the Naval Audit Service to perform a comprehensive review of the PPV program and to report back to me within 60 to 90 days. The objective of this audit is not only to look backwards, but to provide insight into how we can better understand and anticipate emerging trends and align incentives and accountability across the program. Finally, we are reaffirming that our PPV partners must remain an important component of the housing solution offered to military families. Our agreements with them are designed as a partnership and not as a traditional outsourcing contractor relationship. And so we need far more frequent senior leadership engagement with them going forward. We are also ensuring our military leaders understand that we have not outsourced their responsibility to be advocates for our service members who reside in a PPV housing unit. It is an essential function of commanders and small unit leaders to be engaged in the well-being of sailors and Marines and their families. This is a moral obligation commanders have to their people, but it is also one that can have a profound impact on overall readiness of the force. It is important that they understand that the PPV structure is a partnership in which their role in that partnership is not only financial and governance, but rather it is to be an advocate for the tenants whom that partnership serves. We cannot allow ourselves to take our eyes off the ball on this critical responsibility again, and we are taking every possible step to ensure that we don't. I detailed many of the specific actions we have taken in my written statement, and I can assure you the Department of the Navy is all hands on deck in getting after this problem. I respectfully request that the written statement be entered into the record, and thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Henderson.
Good morning. Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. It is an honor to represent our airmen and senior Air Force leaders here today. My full written statement has been submitted for the record, but I just wanted to summarize the actions we've taken to address the challenges with privatized housing at some of our Air Force bases. We've heard the concerns of our airmen, their families, and Congress. And Air Force leadership at every level is aggressively addressing the challenges identified with family housing. We take the health and safety of our airmen and their families very seriously. Air Force leadership is currently working through 39 significant initiatives along 5 lines of effort to empower residents, integrate leadership, improve communication, standardize policy, and improve oversight. On February 12th, Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein directed an Inspector General assessment of policies, procedures, and best practices for handling resident complaints and protecting residents from potential health and safety hazards. This assessment will wrap up soon, and we intend to incorporate their recommendations into this action plan. On February 15th, Secretary Wilson and General Wilson directed a 100% health and safety review of family housing in an effort to identify the scope and extent of our housing challenges across the Air Force. We completed the review on March 1st, and our commanders are addressing over 4,700 deficiencies that were identified. To date, over 1,900 of those deficiencies have been resolved, and we continue to aggressively work with our project owners to close out the remaining 2,800 or so items. And this week, the Secretary, Chief of Staff, and Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force also sent a tri-signed letter to all wing commanders reinforcing their leader roles and responsibilities as they apply to privatized housing management at our bases. We are collaborating with the Office of Secretary of Defense, the other services, Congress, project owners, and our families and advocates to develop a resident Bill of Rights, which is intended to be consistent across all the services. The Air Force submitted a $31.2 million FY20 unfunded request to add 250 personnel to our housing management offices. This team is the center of gravity for advocating for our residents, providing oversight for our project owners, keeping the chain of command informed, and providing the critical on-site leadership and management where it matters the most. We are also taking steps to improve engagement with our airmen who live in privatized housing. For instance, we established a toll-free hotline where residents can report their concerns with privatized housing, and we are crafting a policy to establish tenant councils for both privatized and government-owned housing across the Air Force. Along with these near-term actions, we have also initiated a number of mid- and long-term efforts in collaboration with our project owners to improve performance incentive fee structure, to automate systems for maintenance work order visibility, to add rigor to our maintenance quality assurance, to provide mold and moisture policies, and enhance our annual site audits. Thank you for the invitation to appear here today and for your continued support of our airmen and their families, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Mr. Beller.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lambourne, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on the current state of the Military Housing Privatization Initiative and answer any questions you may have. I want to begin by thanking the committee members for their continued support and commitment to the Army soldiers, families, and civilians. I look forward to working with you to achieve our mutual goal of improving the condition of Army housing. First, I'd like to emphasize that the safety and well-being of our soldiers and their families is paramount. The Army is committed to providing safe and secure housing across its 104,000 family homes, of which more than 87,000 are privatized. The recent reports of substandard conditions in some of our military housing units are deeply disturbing. It is unacceptable for any of our families who sacrifice so much for our country to endure such hardships in their own homes. Army senior leadership directed installations to inspect housing, talk with families, and press housing CEOs into action. We recently required installation commanders to visit all family housing to ensure no family resides in a home with life safety or health deficiencies, and we are currently evaluating the results. Additionally, a recently revised Army survey addressing housing issues will be sent to residents shortly, and we will review our findings with housing CEOs. To further address concerns, each installation garrison commander has established hotlines and conducted town hall meetings, providing residents the opportunity to voice concerns to Army leadership. Common themes at these town hall meetings included poor customer service, lack of work order transparency, and residents' inability to hold housing companies accountable. Additionally, the Service Secretaries recently introduced a Tenant Bill of Rights to which we welcome your input, though the reforms will not stop there. All companies have agreed to ensure sufficient trained technicians and staff will be available to address problems as well as issues brought up in our town hall meetings. The incentive fee structure and project metrics will also be reviewed. Going forward, it will be our task to take these commitments and codify them in project documents. Our mission is to provide high-quality homes and living experiences, both privatized and Army-owned. We remain committed to providing safe and secure housing for our soldiers and their families. But we need to do better. It is clear that we've let some of our Army families down, and moving forward, we're committed to applying the resources necessary to oversee and fully address these issues. Our soldiers and their families deserve no less. Thank you for your interest in this matter, as well as your continued support of the Army.
Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. We have very significant participation by the members of the committee, and we have little time. I would ask the members to see if we can work on 3 minutes rather than 5. Otherwise, we're going to leave a lot of our members without having an opportunity for questions. And I'll make mine very, very brief here. It's very obvious to me that the principal problem here was a lack of attention to this issue. From the witnesses today and from the written testimony as well as personal meetings, the branches of the military, including the Office of the Secretary, have stepped up, paying attention, and have put in place plans that, if enacted and carried out over time, will reduce this problem and quite possibly eliminate it. And I want to make quite sure that the commanders and the officers responsible for the installations are given both the responsibility and the authority to solve the problem on their basis. And I think this is a question that goes to at least the three, well, all four of you. Is that the case? Has this issue been pushed down to the commanders, the officers responsible for the various installations?
Mr. Chairman, let me start. And what I would tell you is we reviewed it from a legal perspective that says that our commanders have full authority to have both the responsibility and the authority to oversee that. And then I'll let the services comment specifically.
Thank you. Let's start with the Navy and just run down the line.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. We have empowered our installation commanders to be at the forefront of trying to resolve these issues. But I would also say it's also a command issue as well. Even to the, as I mentioned in my remarks, at the smaller unit level, making sure that our junior leaders understand their responsibility for watching out for their sailors and Marines and being engaged in that. That helps to elevate issues more quickly, and I think that's going to be a key to getting after these problems more quickly.
Mr. Henderson.
On behalf of the Air Force, yes, we're counting on our leaders and commanders to lead us for our corrective action plan.
On behalf of the Army, absolutely. It's already been implemented. To reinforce to the garrison commanders what their responsibilities, duties, and obligations are in this area. It's reflected in enhanced training that the garrison commanders will have. It also has been reinforced by requiring the garrison commanders to have regular town meetings, be engaged with responding and their housing authorities to the 24/7 hotlines, and basically educating the residents to make sure that they engage their chain of command up through and including the garrison commanders and on up to senior commanders and even the Army headquarters if indeed no satisfaction at the lower level has been incurred. Finally, the garrison commanders also are being instructed in how effectively to use the incentive fee approval that occurs every 90 days as far as appropriately rewarding the private companies for their performance during that time period.
Thank you. Also, it's probable that you will need additional personnel, or at least people assigned to these tasks as we review the and prepare for the NDAA. We'll look specifically for that piece of it. Are people going to be assigned to carry out this? And some of your testimony spoke to that. Mr. Lambourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, thank you for this important hearing. I'll work with you to make sure that the action plans that are formulated are carried out, and we'll continue our oversight in the future. Mr. Henderson, before I get into the general question for all of the service branches that are represented here today, I'm going to ask you about one item in particular that apparently is some late-breaking news, and it has to do with an employee of the firm that operates privatized housing at the Air Force Academy having been arrested for fraud. What can you tell us about that, and does it reflect in any way on the Air Force's oversight?
Good morning. Thanks. This is an ongoing situation at the Air Force Academy and with our project owner there. And it's a very unfortunate situation. But I also think it serves as a good example of what routine oversight looks like and what it looks like when it's working correctly. Just to give a little background, to speak in generality, since it is still ongoing, in the fall of 2017, our project owner and through our normal audits, our annual audits that we do with the projects, we caught some financial anomalies with the management at the Air Force Academy. We immediately took action with an initial investigation conducted by the project owner that the Air Force monitored. Once we found out that those anomalies led us to what we thought was fraudulent activity, we turned those matters over to the law enforcement authorities in Colorado Springs, who conducted their own investigation, again, that we cooperated with. Since then, a person has recently been charged with financial fraud. Hunt, I'm sorry, I wasn't going to say the company. Our project owner has agreed to come back and reimburse the academy the $169,000, which is, we think, was the estimated amount of the financial fraud. So that's taken care of. The matter is still ongoing. We're respecting the investigative process and the due process of the individual charged, but we continue to cooperate with authorities to ensure that these mechanisms are in place so that we can catch these things when they come up each year.
Okay, well, thank you for taking action on that. Please keep the committee informed on how that comes along in the future. And my question for each of the three service branches here, including the Navy and Marines, is, do you have the necessary legislative authorities to improve management of privatized housing, and are you able to carry out your action plan under your current budget numbers?
Sir, I think that we absolutely have enough legislative authority to handle this problem. As has been brought to light, this was really a management and leadership problem, less so than an authorities problem. So I think we're okay in that respect. We probably will need some help with respect to staffing up some of these housing offices in legislation. But I think with respect to authorities, I think we all feel comfortable that there's nothing lacking in the authorities themselves. This is more of us, as the chairman mentioned, paying closer attention to it, getting better metrics so we have more leading indicators of problems before they occur.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson?
I would agree with that. I think with regard to legislative authorities, we have that. Any constraints that we have are really within the transactional documents with the project owners, and in some cases we need to go in and adjust those. For instance, the metrics, performance incentive fees, things like that. And then with regard to help, per my opening statement, we're going to look to restaff our housing offices that were cut during the course of personnel cuts and sequestration. We've decided that was clearly a mistake, and we're asking for $31 million in an unfunded request to restaff those back to their original strength.
Well, I'll insert an editorial comment here before Mr. Beeler comments, and that is sequestration had some very unfortunate results. We know you had to make tough choices and sometimes unpalatable choices. We're hoping that with last year's budget, the current year budget, and next year's budget that we're still negotiating, we have the top line numbers that really allow us to get back to where we should be. Mr. Beeler?
I echo the comments that have just been made by my fellow counterparts in the services. It applies to the Army. We're undergoing comprehensive assessment in what our requirements and needs are. At this point, we don't feel that we need additional legislative authorities. It is clearly, first and foremost, getting our management side of the house in order. We have already hired 119 additional staff for our housing authorities at the installation level. We have money put in for the fiscal year 20 budget to make sure most of those positions are sustained going forward. We know that the private companies with whom we work have committed to up to several hundred additional to perform some of the same overarching oversight, and we will hold them accountable as well. So as I say, we're ongoing assessment, so we'll have a better handle in 3 to 6 months as to how effective we've been in providing the management oversight we need to have, and we will come back to the committee.
Okay, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the first steps that we're taking. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Kim?
Thank you for taking the time to come here today and talk about some of these next steps that you're planning to take. I think that's critically important. But I just want to take a step back here because I want to make sure that as we're talking about this and as we're thinking about these next steps, that we understand that this isn't really just a policy debate here about what to implement here. This is very personal. This was as personal as anything that I've seen in my time in Congress, where right here in this room we had military families telling us about their immediate needs right now. So what I'm concerned about, what I don't have a good sense leaving this room right now yet, is what are you doing right now to be able to address those that have immediate concerns, health concerns, housing concerns with the places that they have right now? You know, what can you say to me right now to assure me that your response to this is at the scale of the magnitude of the problem at stake? A number of you have mentioned how you are doing surveys of different homes, and the numbers of homes that have problems are in the thousands. So have you scaled up? Are you surging personnel and resources right now? Do you have a timeline in which I can reassure some of the families that I'm in touch with that they're going to have the kind of response that they need on an immediate and very personal level? I'd like to just go through the line here, please.
Congressman, if I could, let me start. After the February hearing, I literally gave out my email address to some of the family organizations that if they did not feel that they were getting adequate response, they could email me directly and that I would personally get involved. I've done that on a number of occasions. I've contacted the individuals to my left right now. They have been extremely responsive, and then the follow-up by individual to make sure that we were taking care of issues. I will speak for my partners and they then allow them to speak for themselves, but the responsiveness that we have both in general but to specific issues is focused on ensuring we take care of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and their families.
Representative, I want to echo those points and particularly echo your points. I mean, this is extremely personal for everybody. And as I mentioned in my statement, there are a lot of people who work very, very hard and have done an outstanding job in PPV to ensure these homes are in good condition for our sailors and Marines. But they're now painted with the same broad brush, and that's a little bit unfair, but they're taking it because they recognize that this is part of a family responsibility in the service to handle this. I have 2 children on active duty. One of them has lived in privatized housing. It was fantastic for them. So we know that these are problems that we have to address. We are, as I mentioned, we are talking personally, reaching out personally to every single person in the Navy and Marine Corps who lives in privatized housing. Through that process, we've identified in the Navy side over 4,000 issues, about 4,700 issues. Of those 47, about 2,800 have asked for a personal visit, in-person visit to try and resolve the issue, and we're well on the way at ticking away at that. I think we've made about 900 of those visits to address the specific problems. That's in the Navy. And the Marine Corps has about 7,000, and they've had 7,000 personal visits and follow-up to these questions. So I think we are taking it extremely seriously as well as taking it personally, but we're trying to do everything we can immediately to address the immediate concerns. But the longer-term issues are also very important to us. We just don't want to seem like we're overreacting. We want to make sure that we fix this in the long run, and that's some of the longer-term things that we're working on with the partners as well.
Good morning. Like Mr. McMahon, my family and I spent about 18 years in military housing, some of it privatized, some of it before privatization. And I completely understand how personal this gets with families when things aren't going right, or when the family member's deployed and we're leaving our families to fend for this on their own. And it's a very difficult situation. That's where we went in for the immediate actions and asked for 100% review of the health and safety conditions in our housing. That resulted, and now our numbers are up to close to 50,000 of our families who live in housing have been contacted, interviewed, assessed their safety concerns, and per my opening statement where we had come back, commanders and leaders went into the house, validated what the issues were, and we opened up about 4,700 work orders for which they are now surging on, and we're battle tracking here essentially with the Air Force. At the rate that we're resolving these, I expect it to take another 30 to 45 days to close these out. In some cases where conditions were unsafe, we're moving families into safer housing and taking care of that for them. And then part of this, a huge part of the loss of trust here in our assessment was just a lack of communication, a lack of understanding of what a dispute resolution process, the lack in roles or responsibilities of the commanders and leaders, and a lack of understanding of maybe the resources that were available. So we're working really hard to re-engage and communicate better with our families.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time has expired, but I just want to press having tangible timelines when we can deliver for these families, make sure they're getting the health care that they need, be able to have these remedies in tangible ways. I just ask that we follow up on that. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We're going to try to keep this as tight as we possibly can. We have a lot of members that would like to speak. Mr. Scott, you're next. Oh, before you come on, Mr. Scott, we've received a statement for the record from the Military Officers Association of America. Without objection, we'll enter that into the record here. Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've known General McMahon for a long time now, and I can assure you that if he's in charge of resolving an issue, that you're going to get a satisfactory outcome. He takes it head on and has done a wonderful job, did a wonderful job at Robins Air Force Base. And I'm glad he's in the position he's in. I had a chance to talk with Mr. Henderson yesterday for a while. One of the things that I will tell you in the Bill of Rights that is important to me, and talking to the men and women that came to testify before us, when a contract mandates mediation, and then that contract has loser pay provisions in it that could effectively force a soldier to pay 100% of their annual income to carry a housing company, a multi-million-dollar housing company, to a mediation. That's not acceptable. And so the loser pay provisions of the contracts, I don't mind the mediation. I'm happy that the mediator, as I understand it, is going to be part of the chain of command, but that's not a square deal or a fair fight for our soldiers to mandate mediation and then to mandate loser pay on our soldiers. With that said, I want Mr. Anderson. Hurricane Michael hit the southeastern United States October the 10th. Is the most pressing thing for the Air Force right now in your position as head of installations a disaster supplemental?
So I think the most pressing thing for the Air Force right now is solvency, getting through FY19, and a lot of that is attributed to the money that we fronted on to recover from disasters at Tyndall Air Force Base, now Offutt, earthquakes in Alaska, and by taking the FY19 funds and doing exactly what we believed was the right thing to help those bases recover and get those missions back online. We've asked for supplemental funding, and at this point, without that supplemental funding, we're looking at very severe impacts to Air Force solvency for the rest of FY19.
Perhaps urgent would have been a better word. But I want to make my colleagues aware of this, and I want to give equal criticism where criticism is due. Senator from New York, Senator from Vermont refused to allow a vote to push forward on disaster assistance this past week. We have been promised, those of us hit by this storm have been promised disaster assistance from both sides in both chambers since mid-October, that any bill to open the government would include the disaster assistance and the supplemental funding, including the funding for the Air Force. That hasn't happened. Now, I do think that those games are being played, and I think that it is a senator from New York and a senator from Vermont predominantly playing those games. But I also think it's extremely irresponsible for the Office of Management and Budget to not submit an official request for supplemental disaster assistance funding. And I just can't understand, with the magnitude of the impact of these storms to our Air Force, to readiness, to our installations, to the men and women in uniform, I can't understand why our Office of Management and Budget, controlled by my party, didn't submit a request for supplemental assistance, which I think is absolutely unacceptable. And I think it's unacceptable that Senator Schumer and Senator Leahy have played the games they've played with disaster assistance. And I want to remind everybody, we have one legislative day after today before we leave, and we will not return until April the 29th. Would it make a difference to you if you got a disaster bill today versus, say, May?
Absolutely, Congressman. We've already stopped projects, stopped funding for projects in order to preserve those funds for readiness needs. We're impacting aircraft and satellite repair, and at some point we'll be stopping or slowing down recovery at Tyndall, and we'll only do life, health, and safety things at Offutt. And by deferring that money, since it's one-year money, if there is supplemental funding, that means we have to come back and work twice as fast to get that executed at the end of the year.
My time is about to expire.
Yep.
I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. I apologize for interrupting you, but you're also, according to the Air Force, going to cut 18,000 training and flying hours starting over the next couple of months. Is that correct?
That's the intended consequence without supplemental funding. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I will control myself, although I will say there was $1 billion sloshing around in the Department of Defense that could have been made available for this purpose. Let me now move to our next, Ms. Houlihan.
Hi, and thank you. And Mr. Scott, I also appreciate your comments, too, and I don't think it's a good idea to play games. I trained at Tyndall Air Force Base, but I also have family in Puerto Rico, and I feel like we're playing with everybody's lives in these partisan games, and so I appreciate your comments. I also am a third-generation military member myself. My dad and my grandfather served full careers in the Navy, and my brother and I grew up in military housing. My mom and her 5 brothers and sisters grew up in military housing off and on, and so this is personal to me, too, for a lot of reasons. And so my questions first are sort of, I guess, tactical in nature, and then are maybe a little bit more personal in nature. One is that we've talked a little bit about readiness and whether or not people are genuinely going to be able to deploy when they have issues like this at home. But a second question is, how about recruitment? Have you seen any sort of implications to this in terms of recruitment because of this narrative that's been following military housing around?
Congresswoman, I'll start, and then I'll turn it over to the services. We all understand that we recruit the individual, we retain the family, and they care about 4 things. Our military families are tremendously resilient, and they can go with just about any challenges they face. All they ask for is a safe place to live in, adequate medical attention, good schools for their kids, and when we move them, we don't break all their stuff. And so this is an integral part. In reality, we're working those issues today. I personally have 2 of those 4 that are on my plate. We are dead serious about making sure that we provide our military families, whether on installation or off, with a safe place to live and something they can.
But, and I guess I only have 3 minutes time. Has anybody any data about whether or not this has impacted recruitment in any form?
Representative, we don't have any data on that just yet. We are obviously getting pressurized on recruiting because of the state of the economy. That's always going to cause us issues, but we haven't seen anything yet related to this that's impacting either recruiting or retention in the Navy.
Thank you. And my second question is also a two-part question. And I, in addition to being a former military member, a veteran, I am also a mom. And I spent the last few years of my career focused on early childhood development, pre-K through fourth grade literacy particularly. We know that kids under 6 who are exposed to things like lead and like mold and those sorts of things end up experiencing pretty significant delays. Have we, I know that Mr. Henderson, you talked a little bit about the 50,000 people who you had documented. Have we quantified at all how many kids under 6 have been impacted by this?
Ma'am, we have not quantified numbers for children under 6.
And my second part of the question is, if we haven't quantified that, perhaps we should, but has there been any effort to put some sort of teeth into this by identifying through teachers or daycare providers or parents themselves sort of the signs that you should look for if your child has been impacted by mold or your child has been impacted by lead?
We have, Madam, I'd like to take that for the record. It's an important question and get you a detailed response. We've done some communications with mold awareness for our families who move into the homes, especially when we have ones that are prone to mold and in areas that are prone to mold. I don't know that we've reached out to teachers and counselors and outside folks like that, though.
Congresswoman, if I could add to that as well, we have created within the Office of Secretary of Defense a team of both our military construction or family housing personnel, plus our medical folks, to begin to look at where there is a cross-utilization of some of the experiences that we've had. An integral part of that is one of our deputy assistant secretaries who happens to be a pediatrician, who happens to be an expert in the effects of both lead and mold to help us better understand how we ought to move forward. So we're not where we want to be with that, but we are looking at that and have an understanding that we need to do a better job in the future of being able to respond to the issues of our children.
And this has something to do with sort of what Representative Kim was talking about, which is I think that we can all agree that we're in a bad place. I think what we need to agree on is what the path forward is and how we, I'm an engineer, how we quantify it, how we measure it, you know, how we move forward with discrete programs that will address it. And I'm just sort of poking around for that. I only have a half a minute left. Does anybody have any sort of quantifiable discrete programs that are out there to address these issues, particularly pre-K or early childhood development issues?
Ma'am, the Army has comprehensive testing of children under 6 for lead, particularly focused on housing from pre-1978, and has been able to track data that shows that children with lead in their systems at that age within the greater Army community, all children are tested for lead, whether they're in the 78 old housing or not. And the vast majority, which is an extremely small minority of such children, are actually, they reside outside military housing. So the important thing for the Army is...
Sorry, I've run out of time, but I'm happy to take the rest of your answer on the record.
We will happy to do it. The point is that we test the children regardless of where they are housed and track it appropriately through their development.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Houlihan, you raised an important issue, one that the committee has become aware of a document produced by the Navy and the Marine Corps Public Health Center that seems to discourage clinicians from suggesting that a patient's home could be contributing to their condition, and to, and here I quote, avoid commenting on the habituality, integrity, and remediation requirements for specific buildings, end quote. I'm sure the Navy has taken steps to rescind that memo and to send out an appropriate one. We'll let it go at that. I'd like now to turn to Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here. I heard someone mention it about the role of the commander. And when you think about the role of a unit commander, whether it's, let's say, go right down to platoon commander and a second lieutenant and a platoon sergeant, okay, we know that the role of the command team at any unit level is not just on the battlefield. It's 24/7. If you're deployed, it's one thing. If you're in garrison, it's another thing, but it's the welfare of your troops and their families. And I was glad to hear you mention that, because that is one of the challenges, as you know, as we bring in the all-recruited force here in its third generation, is that it's not a 9-to-5 Monday through Friday job. You have responsibility for the health and welfare of all of your Marine soldiers, sailors, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, et cetera. And I applaud your efforts to develop that role in conjunction with the continuing role of the base commander, and how that all relates then to those being served, the families, and then how largely then it falls into the base commander's lap in dealing with patricians or Lincoln or whoever the PPV owner of the property is. This is evolving, and we know we have issues, but I applaud you, and whatever we as Congress can do to back you up as you develop that role of those various commanders, and then with the company, the companies, that is going to be our success. We'll get through this, but I just thank you for that, and I'll buy back some of the valuable thing that we cannot ever get back is time, and I yield back.
Mr. Bergman, thank you so very, very much. We all look for more time. Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to follow up on the focus on command. I think each of you responded to the chairman's question about the important role that first-line leaders have all the way up the chain of command to the installation commander. I think it's been a common failing that's been addressed as more and more of this issue has been exposed about the lack of role that command has played thus far. And so my question is, as you've said, this will be the focus going forward. What will change so that the command is empowered to actually do something about it? It's one thing to be informed of the issue. It's another thing to actually be empowered. Were they not empowered to take action to address some of these problems with the contractors previously? If not, what will change so that they can going forward? Mr. McMahon.
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. If you go back early in the program when folks didn't think they understood it, we had very comprehensive education programs for our leaders to describe to them what their role was, what authorities they did not have, what authorities they had, so that they could effectively oversee the privatization effort. Over time, as we became comfortable, as we looked at the metrics and perceived the metrics to tell us it was going well, as you know, we have an infinite number of issues, a finite amount of time in terms of training. This, quite frankly, is something that fell off the scope. We thought it was going fine, and so we reduced and then in some cases actually eliminated that education as part of our leadership development for our leaders at all levels. The reality is, of when we look at this today, it was an issue that we should not have dropped off, and the services are taking action today to reinstitutionalize that training that was integral a decade ago, but over time, as we've continued to reduce that training, has fallen off the scope. And I'll let them comment further.
Thank you.
Representative, I think it's a really, really good, important question, because some of the things that we can do at the command level, I think, are very, very simple, not sophisticated things at all. Asking our junior leaders to have a face-to-face conversation with their people once a week and ask them, how are things going with your housing? How are things going with your family? Look them in the eye and just ask those questions. That's not a high-tech solution, but that would solve a lot of these problems. The biggest problem, that, from my perspective in looking at this, was finding out about issues after they had become major problems. So we need to have much better systems and ways to understand issues as they emerge, as we start seeing trends. And the data is all there. Most of our partners manage these properties using the same data system. We just have to be able to get into there and understand when trends are happening, so we can measure how long it's taking, and we can start raising the alarm bells at the right time. So that's sort of more on the sophisticated data side. But to your point, we have to emphasize with our younger leaders how important it is to have those types of conversations because of their responsibility to the member and their families.
I'm going to do something here. Mr. Beeler, you've been kind of on the far edge of this table. So if we can jump over to you, then we'll come back to the Air Force.
I'll just add another follow-up to that, Mr. Beeler, that I wanted to, that's linked to this, but also to something you mentioned earlier about making some changes that will reward some of the private contractors. You know, from my standpoint, we're talking about a basic level of service that we as taxpayers are paying these companies to provide for our service members and their families. So I guess my first question is, as we're talking about empowerment, we're also talking about accountability. So before we start talking about rewards, I think we first need to address how these contractors are being held accountable for providing what we are paying them to do.
Thank you, Representative. And what I meant by quote, and I should have put it in quotes, rewarding the private companies, is that every 90 days, and I think this applies to across the services, there is an incentive fee determination that is made by the garrison commander based on performance of the private companies. And it is the perfect opportunity and responsibility for the companies to be, if you will, judged and rated, so that if the companies have not done well in those 90 days, they don't get 100% of the incentive fees. In some cases, they might not get any percent of the incentive fees. And the point that I was attempting to make is that the garrison commanders, in the case of the Army, had all too often sort of rubber stamped the request for 100% award of incentive fees per quarter. That's no longer the case. We actually have removed, for the time being, and brought it up to Army headquarters to, A, make those determinations, but more importantly, we're training the garrison commanders to know their responsibility in this area, and that they will take advantage of the data collection on, for instance, the work order responsiveness and performance to help them make the judgment.
Thank you, Mr. Beeler. I'm sorry, my time has expired. It's obviously very disturbing to see that this kind of rubber stamp 100% incentive payments were being made previously. Glad to hear that it's not any longer. I hope we have the opportunity to address the fact that if a contractor is not performing, if they are underperforming and not meeting their marks, we're not talking about getting a lower percentage of incentives. We're talking about accountability to make sure that they are actually doing what they are contracted to do before you even begin to have a conversation about incentives. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Horn?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the chairman and ranking member for this critical conversation. I have many things I want to ask and say. First, I'm glad we're addressing this, but second, I still remain horrified at the stories that I have heard from service members and their families in my community and across the country. And as we continue to address this, there's a couple of things that I want to start off with. Is going further into the conversation around the culture, the commanders, and how this was allowed to get to the place where it was. Because I've heard a couple of you say that you're beginning to address it, and that these were a few people, and that I am incredibly troubled by the fact that that these companies were getting their full incentive pay, even as thousands of people across this country and enlisted and their families who are suffering. I have stories from my district and images of these things that were being covered up, and it's unacceptable. And as we move forward to fix this problem, one, I want to find out if you have begun to make any plans to reimburse these families for the out-of-pocket costs for things including mold testing, medical care, and so many other things that our military families have had to incur as a result of the mismanagement and and problems that these companies have caused.
Representative, thanks for the question. I don't know that we have been presented with opportunities to do that. However, once we are, I am quite certain we'll look at those and figure out a way to compensate if there was a problem like that. I just am not aware, and I'll take that one for the record to find out exactly what's happened in the past with respect to those types of issues.
And for the Air Force, what we've done is ensured that we've in an effort to better communicate with our residents, make sure that they know they have resources inside the Air Force and legal assistance resources inside the Air Force to request claims and make claims against the project owner for costs like mold testing, maybe damages to furniture or something because of negligence, or extended medical care costs, and so we've provided the information for them to better go about doing that.
In the case of the Army, the project companies are reimbursing family. We'll take further details for the record, but this has been ongoing at least over the past several months, if not longer.
Thank you. And following up on a couple of other things for Ms. Gabbard and Mr. Scott. One, I want to echo, and I appreciate that being on this committee and working with the concern across the aisle that these are not issues that should ever be partisan, and we should be placing the well-being of our service members above everything else. So to Mr. Scott's point, I just want to reiterate that the fact that we have loser pay provisions and forced mediation from enlisted is something that I would like to say I think we need to address. And Mr. McMahon, I'd like to know if there's any plans to begin to address those issues.
Congresswoman, as you look at the Bill of Rights that we're putting together, that we've shared with the committees so we can get your specific input, next week we'll sit with the family organizations, share it with them so they have the opportunity. But that's exactly what we want to ensure we deal with the Bill of Rights, that it's clear to both our private partners as well as to our members what they can expect, and set those expectations before we get into a situation where we're trying to resolve this.
And finally, I want to circle back one more time to Ms. Gabbard's point about the incentive fees, and if there's been a consideration that these fees could be recovered that were previously paid, if there's any pathway to recover some of those fees for these properties that were clearly mismanaged and are now requiring costs be outlaid for health care, for so many other things for our service members.
Congresswoman, I'll take it for the four of us. I'm unaware. I'll go back and talk to our acquisition personnel to see if there is, but I'm unaware of any tools, since we have made the commitment at this point, that they could be recovered.
Thank you. Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. Ms. Holland?
Thank you very much, Chairman. And thank you all so much for taking the time to be here today. Like some of my colleagues, I was raised in military housing as well. My dad had a 30-year career in the Marine Corps, and so I spent my entire childhood growing up on military bases. And it's interesting that back when I was a kid, before you could move out, they'd come in with a white glove and go in every corner and look in every vent, and I mean it was as disciplined as my father's career was, and so it is a little disheartening to have learned about this over the past months, and it's happening, in fact, in my home state of New Mexico, where the climate is extremely dry. So I am disheartened, to say the least. But in addition to everything that's been mentioned here today, I've heard reports that retaliation still persists against military families who are raising concerns about the conditions of their housing. This is extremely troubling, as retaliation is a big part of the breach of trust between the Department of Defense and families that lead these families to come to the press and to Congress in the first place, and it must stop. I realize that for some military wives, one way they can communicate with other families is through social media, and so I realize that is one way they've been trying to figure out who all is suffering from the same issues that they are. So I wanted to ask each of you if you commit now to adopting and enforcing a zero tolerance policy on retaliation against any families, any military families who are raising concerns about the housing, including within the chain of command on the bases where our service members live and serve, in the housing offices that should be advocating for our military families, and among the private contractors who we are paying to serve our families. So if each of you could let me know if the zero tolerance policy on retaliation is happening now and if it's being enforced.
Congressman, I'll tell you that we have zero tolerance for it, to the point of proactively giving out our email addresses. So if we hear of it, folks can reach out to us to take it. But absolutely a zero tolerance.
And for the Department of the Navy representative, absolutely that is the case. We've made it very clear to our partners it's unacceptable, and it's also one of the key planks of the Tenant Bill of Rights that we're developing.
Thank you.
Ma'am, that has always been the policy of the Air Force, and this was an opportunity for us to reinforce that.
Ma'am, the same with the Army, and one step forward, the Army has an Inspector General assessment going on that will be completed in about a month and a half, and that's one of the aspects that they are looking into to see if there is any such activity reported and further investigate. And so we will have confirmation of exactly the lay of the land, and if there is such activity, it will be dealt with appropriately within the particular channels involved.
Thank you. And I'll ask that any of those contact emails or contact numbers be submitted to the record, so that in the chance that anyone from my district calls me and tells me they're being retaliated against, I can actually have some information where they can contact someone to remedy that situation. So thank you for that. Who is actually, you might have already kind of answered this, but who is responsible for investigating claims of retaliation against families, whether internal or external to the Department of Defense? Do we know that?
Within the department and with each of the servicemen, the Inspector General has a responsibility of taking that on. Prior to that point, our leadership ought to be looking at those issues, and should it get to the level, it'd be the DOD IG, but each of the service inspector generals will look at that.
Excellent. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? No? Okay. And what are there any consequences, and what are they for anyone who retaliates against any military families trying to report these housing issues? And to your knowledge, have those been enforced?
Congressman, in terms of specific actions, I will tell you that because there is zero tolerance, if it's a military member, a specific action is taken against that individual on a range of different actions. If it is a civilian member of the Department of Defense, action is taken against them up to and including removal from service of the nation. So it is taken very seriously.
Thank you. And last on this issue, when and how will you communicate this policy, including resources for families and the consequences for those who engage in retaliation to relevant parties?
Congresswoman, across the board, each of our services have communicated that to their members and the families. Part of the town halls that you've heard alluded to is underscoring the fact that there is zero tolerance for retaliation. I have personally shared that with all of the CEOs of the respective privatization partners that we have, so there is clear understanding of what our expectations are, and that is that we support our family members and our military members in terms of privatized housing.
Thank you very much. And Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Holland. We have completed the first round of questions. Mr. Lamborn, if you'd like to make some closing remarks, if you would, and then I'll do the same. And
thank you. And this is an important hearing. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the first steps that each of the services and the DoD-wide are making. I can tell that the specificity is there, the metrics, the harnessing of incentives, the re-education or better education of down to the garrison level of the leverage that we do have with the private contractors, and for them to be it to be reinforced to them of their obligations and responsibilities, and contractually and morally. So I'm really happy that we are making progress, but we will be continuing to oversee this. This is something that is had, like I say, good first steps, but it's only the first steps, and time will prove and tell that this is being successfully rectified, and I look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I want to thank the committee members for their intense interest in this matter, and equally, and perhaps more important, the family members who had the courage to bring this issue to the attention of Congress. You've done a great service for all of the members, all of the men and women who serve in our military, and I want to really express to you those people that had the courage to come forward. You've made a difference. Within really 2 months here, in less than 2 months, the leadership of the Department of Defense and the services have stepped forward and have put in place a series of projects and programs that should, if carried out over time, resolve many of these problems. I want to just follow up on some of those. First of all, each of the services and the Secretary, the Office of Secretary, have indicated that they have emails and telephone numbers that are available to receive complaints. I assume that those will be available. The committee will have those, and we'll make those available to anybody that would like those. Similarly, when the Bill of Rights is produced, I believe there's a draft that the committee has. I think it is being updated as we today and on into the days ahead. When that update is available, we'll pass it around to all the members of the committee and to any member of Congress that's interested for their comment as to the effectiveness, the efficiency, or the sufficiency of it. And that will, I assume, have the various contacts within the garrisons, within the installations, as well as at headquarters. Also, we noticed that each of the services are rebuilding the personnel necessary to monitor. That'll be part of the work that we'll do in the NDAA and the upcoming work that this committee has in that regard to make sure that that is in place. And we will, of course, beg our appropriators to fund those positions. The lease contracts are under review. The information that I've received on some of the leases would indicate that the leases that are in effect would clearly be illegal in some states and communities, for example, Washington, D.C. So those contracts are in process of being reviewed. That is the contract between the owner of the housing and the tenant, that is the military family. So that'll be a part of it, and I would assume those leases will also have the new leases will have some sort of mechanism for complaints. The issue of retaliation has been raised by all the members and by the services. Those issues of retaliation are over, and we'll be watching. Finally, we will be following up. I want to commend and compliment the services and the Office of the Secretary for jumping on this issue for laying out paths that will resolve these issues going forward. And heads up, folks, we're going to be coming back to this issue before this year is over. We'll let a couple of months go by. We'll see how things are going, and then you all come back, and we'll have a conversation to see the progress that has been made. With that, we are adjourned.
How are you doing? Yeah, family member.
I know you're not. That's
Smaller levels, like the workers that are smaller, easier. The hard ones that How are you? I'm good. Yeah, we are experiencing meeting away with progress is going really well. Back about summer. Figured that one out. Yeah. Right now for some of our work. It's not. I got the pictures that I was saying yesterday, and I got some more increase. It's not. So some of the small populations, they're going to take care of it. We're looking at we're looking at right now. The rest of her neighbors have it as well, and we are really putting on information and leadership spirit to see that you cannot pay out of the reinvestment account, but you can get appropriated that's kind of DPW stuff. So once that water is permitted to that home, DPW can't find it right for the rate of It just came down. It just came out yesterday. And there was supposed to be some sort of ETC last night about it. I haven't heard what's happened with that, but all of it was suspended even at 1.
As the hearing wraps up, members headed to the floor for what should be the last votes of the week in the U.S. House. The Senate, meanwhile, gavels in at 11 a.m. Eastern.